All right. So hi everyone, my name is Dan Liberatori, and I'm going to talk to you about some of the work that I've been doing at the University of Birmingham with corpora. And basically it's going to go like this. I'm going to tell you a question that I got asked when working as an ALT up in Aomori. And I'm going to tell you how I use the corpus to basically try to find an answer to that question. I don't know if it's the answer, but it's an answer. Tell you a little bit about what I found out, and finally discuss how I use corpora in my teaching practice and also in my translation practice. So basically, we'll start with the question. This was asked to me by my coworker, a Japanese teacher of English called Mr. Sasaki, who you see here, very good friend. He was marking some exams, and he wanted to know which is the correct sentence. I played basketball in school, or I played basketball at school. And as we all probably know, there really is no correct answer. Both of them are equally acceptable sentences. And most English language textbooks will tell you that both in and at are locative prepositions. You can use them to tell where something took place. But what second language learners really lack, and most textbooks will not give information about this, is in which situations we're more likely to use in, and in which situations we're more likely to use at. So students struggle with this because they know, oh, there's both things are correct, which one do you use? And teachers struggle with this because this is part of the confidence that they lack when teaching. We've discussed some of the issues between non-native English teachers and native English speakers who work as teachers, and it's come up a few times already about confidence being an issue in the classroom, and teachers non-native speakers lack the intuition as to in which situations one is used over the other, so this is a problem for them. So this is what I was asked, and I wanted to give a bit of a reasonable answer that didn't just rely on my own intuitions, because my intuitions about the English language may be wrong. So I wanted to work with real language data, and that's what a corpus gives us. So let me tell you about how I went about researching this. When we're working with a corpus, we're working with data, so we have to choose a data set first. Means selecting corpus and then choosing which data we're going to look for inside that corpus. Once we have that data set, we can start asking some questions, numerical stuff, and then we can actually go into the text itself, read the text, and see if we can find any patterns based on our understanding of the text. So let's start with the corpus. I chose to use the British National Corpus for this, for reasons you may all be able to appreciate. And for my search term, I chose to use in and at within 3 tokens of the lemma school. And all this means, as I'm sure most of you already know, is that a sentence like this would form part of the data set because the word school is immediately next to its preposition. So would a sentence like this, because the word school is 3 words or 3 tokens away from its preposition. Tan down, primary, school, we got 3. But a sentence like this would be excluded from my data set because school is simply too far away from its preposition, so this is not entering the data set. So we have a corpus, we have a search term, that's our data set, looks something like this. It's over 11,000 instances of the lemma school, preceded by a preposition either in or at. So now that I have this, I can start asking some questions, starting with, which is the more common one? Which do we use more frequently, in school or at school? Well, just getting the raw numbers here, we see that in school is more frequent than at school. 6,400 instances versus 5,100 instances of at. However, the word in the English language is just much more common, almost by a factor of 4. We use in everyday English just much more frequently, so if you were to take any random sample of the English language, you would expect there to naturally be more ins. And the British National Corpus helpfully calculates some scores for us that tells us that even though we see in more frequently, at is actually a stronger collocation to the word school. So that's nice. We can ask if there are any factors which influence these collocation scores. For example, one thing that I found was that when following a noun, when this prepositional phrase followed a noun, for example, I study science at school, science being a noun, the log likelihood scores reverse, and the MI scores at is still a little bit stronger, but the gap narrows. So it seems that when following a noun, in actually starts becoming a bit of a stronger preposition, a stronger collocation, whereas when following a verb, at retains its lead. So that was interesting. Another question that I could ask was, in different types of text and different types of conversation, do we use one more often than the other? And in most cases, this seems to be, there's some difference, but nothing too great, until we get to academic discourse and natural spoken conversation. And we see that in academic discourse, in school is used much more frequently than at school. And in spoken conversation, at school is used much more frequently, well, somewhat more frequently than in school. And this is interesting because, as we saw in the previous slide, in school follows nouns much more often. And one thing we know about academic writing is that noun phrases and nominalization are just rampant. So it's starting to paint a bit of a picture there. And we also know, similarly, that in spoken conversation we'll tend to use shorter clauses, more processes, so we can start to see why these two data points would be kind of linked up. Where's it going with this? Oh yeah, so one thing we could maybe posit is that in school is just a more formal register. We use in school when we're writing, or we use in school when we want to sound formal and academic, and we use at school when we're just talking and chatting. But I don't think this is the correct interpretation, and let me tell you about some of the actual qualitative analysis that I did to explain why. And qualitative analysis basically involves just going through the text in this data set and reading it and trying to find patterns based on our actual understanding of what's being said. There's over 11,000 lines of text here, so going through and reading each one of them is quite a proposition. But there are tools we can use to help, such as sorting the data, or something called hypothesis testing, or using various probes. So I went through a lot of this, reading several hundreds of these lines, and here's what I found out. For these kind of instances of the word school, I felt they were quite unique. Well, not unique, but they had something in common. The river runs in at Town Primary School. Do you know what I done at school today? Where's Auntie Susan? She's at school. In each of these examples, the word school is a physical location. You can step into it and you're surrounded by the walls, and it's somewhere where you can do things. You can point to it on a map. Whereas in these four examples, children who are already in schools, or swap engineers for any other subject in school, you used to have free lunch in schools. In these four examples, schools is just used much more abstractly. I mean, your children can be in school, but they may not be in school at this very moment. They may be at home doing homework. You would still say that they're in school. Similarly, engineering is a subject in school, but we don't have it in a box inside a school. It's in school in a much more abstract sense. So I found these two different senses of the word school. I named them the stage sense and the institution sense. The stage interpretation is basically because the school functions as a stage where events happen. And the institution sense is simply because the school is basically associated with this abstract notion of an institution of learning. And while the correlation is not quite as extreme as these examples would lead you to believe, the stage interpretation seems to be heavily favoring the at preposition, whereas the institution meaning seems to be favoring the in preposition. So this is what I think I found out, and I thought it was quite interesting, but I wanted to see if this had any predictive value. So I conducted a survey of 33 native English speakers, most of them English teachers up in northern Aomori. And the survey looked something like this. It was basically 15 sentences taken from the British National Corpus with the prepositions removed. And the respondents were asked to say whether they thought, which preposition they thought was the most natural, or whether both were equally good, and they just could not decide. And the results came in like this. For all the sentences which I felt showed the stage meaning of the word school, the at responses heavily overwhelmed the in responses. And a chi-squared test tells us that this is statistically significant, meaning that the at interpretation of the word school seems to be a reasonable predictor. The stage interpretation of the word school seems to be a reasonable predictor of at responses. On the other side, for the institution meaning, all the sentences which I thought showed the institution meaning of the word school, most of the answers came back in, and again, the chi-squared test tells us that this is a statistically significant result, meaning that the institution meaning appears to be a reasonable predictor of the preposition here as well. So how do I use this kind of work in my teaching? Well, here I am looking rather ridiculous, but also rather confident, because I know that what I'm teaching to my students is backed up by data. I'm not just teaching them what I think is in my head and just my thoughts about language. I'm teaching them stuff that I can actually point to, run statistics on, and I think that kind of confidence is a good thing to have in the classroom. We can also use corpus data for creating materials or for proving things to our students. Again, if a student asks me, is writing an academic paper, and they come to ask me, should I write in school or at school here, I can show them 100 examples of academic papers featuring, maybe 75% of them will have in school. And I'll show them, see, this is the way it is. Most people write it like this. So having that kind of evidence, I think, is really good for our students as well. It's also really good for a lot of other dealings, like I've done some consultation for textbook creating companies, and they like to see this. When they ask me which is the more natural option, I can tell them what I think, but I can also show them, like, here's 1,000 examples of this being used in real language. So this kind of evidence is really useful in a lot of facets of the education business. Finally, here's a picture of me and a bunch of co-workers up in Aomori, and there's English teachers here. I'm from Canada. There's people here from the UK, from New Zealand, from America, and each one of us speaks a different language. And what really struck me about the questionnaire that I distributed is the really, really low number of cannot decide responses. Almost everyone who responded to these questions was fairly certain that either in or at was the correct response in that situation. And yet, not a single question had a unanimous response. All speakers could not agree on which preposition was the most natural, and yet everyone was pretty certain that theirs was the correct interpretation. I think working with corpora like this shows us that what we think are hard and fast rules really are not. It makes us a little bit more lenient with our students. It makes us appreciate that there's different facets of language, and it's going to be really important to have that, especially if you work as an ALT like I did, and I don't know who's coming in after me. I'm going to be in that school for 5 years, but who was there before me? Who was there after me? I shouldn't be teaching my students that at is the correct thing to use here, because whoever comes after me might think differently. So I think that having that broad perspective is really useful. In summation, corpus linguistics can help us reveal things about our language that we do not just have access to internally. It has a place in education, both for explaining things to students and for just for giving us our confidence, as well as for a lot of making materials like textbooks or even worksheets. And finally, it helps us to confront this fact that English is a global language and it's not just confined to our heads. Everyone speaks a slightly different English, and we have to respect that. Thank you very much, and here's a whole bunch of sources. Enjoy the conference. I have 1 minute, possibly, for one question. Yeah.
Find any regional differences?
I did not check for that. Actually, I did briefly check for that. I found nothing. It was a relatively small sample, only 33 respondents, so it wasn't enough to make any really good predictions on. I checked for it. I didn't see anything starkly, that's really stood out, but it was such a small sample that I couldn't make any reasonable inferences about that. Oh, one thing about that, though, is that there is some work, and there's a study cited in here that shows that there's very little difference between preposition usage between American and British English. So that seems to be a relatively stable finding. It's been replicated a couple of times, and so that's why partly why I was confident going with the corpus that I did, because I didn't think there would be so much difference between an American corpus and a British corpus. Thank you very much.